Spilling scalding coffee on a crime lord's lap usually ended careers. Sometimes it ended lives. For Opal Hennessy, it merely ended the comfortable silence of her first morning on the job. The man sitting behind the desk hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He simply looked down at the spreading dark stain across the front of his charcoal, Ermenegildo Zegna trousers, with the particular stillness of someone wondering whether or not a punishment was warranted. Opal Hennessy stood frozen in the doorway of the 42nd floor office, holding a now empty ceramic mug and what remained of her dignity, which was not much. She was 26 years old, 5'4", somewhere in the neighborhood of 270 pounds of soft curves, frizzy dark hair, and the kind of catastrophic bad luck that followed certain people the way weather systems followed coastal towns. She had tripped on the edge of the Persian rug. That was all. One small architectural injustice, and suddenly she was staring across an ocean of mahogany desk at Caelan Morrow, the most feared man in Montreal's criminal underworld, wearing his morning espresso. "I am," Opal said, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances, "deeply, catastrophically sorry." Caelan Morrow looked up. He was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she was walking into when the staffing agency sent her here. She'd been told Meridian Capital was a private equity firm. She'd been told the pay was exceptional. She'd been told Mr. Morrow expected precision, discretion, and the ability to keep a schedule under pressure. What she had not been told was that the man in question looked like he'd been carved from something harder than marble, that his eyes were a particular shade of pale grey that made her think of ice over deep water, or that the two men standing silently at either end of the room were wearing earpieces and had the quiet, economical posture of people trained to do serious violence quickly. "Your name," Caelan said. "Not a question." Opal Hennessy. She set the empty mug carefully on the edge of his desk, as though being tidy now might retroactively cancel what had just happened. "I'm the Temp, from Beaumont Staffing. I was told to bring you a coffee at 8:15. I did bring it. The delivery was just non-traditional." One of the men at the far wall made a sound that was almost definitely a suppressed laugh. Caelan's gaze moved to him. The sound stopped. "The files on the left credenza," Caelan said, returning to the document in front of him. "Sort them by date. Oldest to newest, don't speak." Opal nodded, moved toward the credenza, and spent the next 4 hours proving that whatever her relationship with gravity, her brain was an entirely different matter. She had been organized since childhood. Growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Verdun with her mother, who worked nights at the hospital laundry and days at a dépanneur, Opal had learned early that competence was the only currency she had reliable access to. She typed 87 words per minute. Her filing system had once made a CPA weep with what he called uncomplicated elegance. She remembered dates, cross-referenced without being asked, and caught errors the way other people caught colds. Effortlessly, constantly, usually at inconvenient moments. By noon, she had reorganized 6 months of his correspondence into a system so intuitive that Caelan's aide, a compact, watchful man named Felix, who was not on the list she'd been handed, stopped pretending not to observe her and just openly watched. "You've done this before," Felix said. "I've done a lot of things before," Opal replied, carefully labeling a folder. "Mostly badly, in terms of the physical components. The paperwork has always been fine." Surviving the first day was improbable. Surviving the first week was the kind of statistical anomaly that men in Caelan Morrow's organization did not know what to do with. By Wednesday, the consensus among the various silent, well-tailored men who moved through the 42nd floor was that Opal Hennessy was either the bravest woman in Montreal or the most oblivious. On Tuesday afternoon, she had wheeled the mail trolley directly into a meeting between Caelan and 3 associates from Toronto, sending a cascade of sealed envelopes across a glass table that, as she later learned, contained documents that did not officially exist. She had apologized, gathered everything with efficient speed, and sorted the mail back into the correct order without looking at a single thing. The Toronto men had exchanged a glance. Caelan had watched her hands the entire time. On Wednesday, she'd jammed the industrial shredder in the document room with a staple she'd forgotten to remove. While waiting for building maintenance, she'd absent-mindedly tidied the shelf above the machine and discovered, behind a false panel, she'd nudged loose with her elbow, a locked metal box that she immediately, reflexively pushed back into place and covered with a stack of quarterly reports she'd found on the floor. She told no one. She mentioned it to no one. When Kaelin's associate Garrett came in 20 minutes later and checked the panel with the practiced ease of someone who checked it regularly, he found it exactly as he'd left it and looked at Opal, who was eating a granola bar and reading a shipping manifest, with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. What baffled them most was the competence. They had expected, and by Friday Opal understood they had genuinely expected, a nervous breakdown, a tearful resignation, or at minimum a single question they weren't equipped to answer. Instead, she reorganized the digital calendar, identified 3 scheduling conflicts in the next month that Kaelin's previous assistant had not caught, and quietly emailed the relevant parties to propose alternatives. She didn't ask permission. She fixed things. That, in Kaelin Morrow's world, was almost more alarming than the disasters. It was on Thursday afternoon that she knocked on his office door, waited for him to look up, and said, "The La Riviere account has a discrepancy. Someone's been billing handling fees twice, once under freight and once under logistics surcharges. It's been running for about 8 months. Total overage is somewhere around 160,000. The room went very quiet. Kaelin set down his pen. "You found this. The columns weren't balancing. Numbers don't trip over Persian rugs," she said. Her hands were steady, but her heart was doing something operatic in her chest. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand for the printed sheet she was holding. He read it again. His jaw shifted slightly. "Has anyone else seen this?" "No. I came straight to you." Something moved behind his pale grey eyes. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition, the way you might look at an unexpected tool that turned out to be exactly the right shape for a job you'd been unable to finish. "I'll handle it," he said. "I assumed," Opal said, and went back to her desk. The pastries started the following Monday. They appeared on her desk before she arrived. A brown paper bag from a boulangerie on Saint-Denis she'd mentioned in passing to no one except herself. Quietly, while walking past it on her lunch break 3 days prior. Inside were 2 butter croissants and a pain au chocolat, still warm. There was no note. When she looked up, Garrett was staring at the far wall with great dedication. It happened every morning after that. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a lot of things that month. Kaelin Morrow had not survived 42 years and the particular geography of Montreal's organized crime landscape by being sentimental. He had built Meridian Capital from a mid-level distribution operation into a legitimate-facing empire that controlled significant portions of the port, 2 private security companies, a commercial real estate portfolio, and 3 levels of political relationship that his lawyers referred to as community partnerships. He wore custom shirts. He kept a curated silence. His inner circle, a handful of men who'd been with him for over a decade, treated his moods like weather systems, noted, respected, navigated carefully. He did not, historically, bring pastries. But there was something about Opal Hennessy that had colonized a corner of his attention he hadn't known was available. She wasn't afraid of him, not in the numb, performative way that some people adopted as armor, going blank and agreeable and waiting for him to tell them what to do. She looked at him directly. She disagreed with his scheduling choices out loud and with specific reasons. When he'd overridden her calendar adjustment for a Friday meeting, and the resulting conflict had caused exactly the problem she'd flagged, she'd said simply, "I'll reschedule it." And not a word more, but she'd looked at him with an expression that communicated a full sentence. She moved through his world like a warm system through cold air, leaving small disturbances everywhere she went. She knocked things over. She apologized to the things she knocked over. She called his most senior enforcer Hon by accident on her 4th day, and then turned a shade of red that was genuinely alarming before Garrett, of all people, had told her not to worry about it, which had surprised both of them. And she was, under all of it, extraordinarily good at her job. He had fired the man who made a comment about her weight in the hallway. He hadn't announced it or explained it. Garrett had simply not been wrong when he told the others that the comment had been made at 9:47 and the man had been escorted from the building by 10:15. Nobody said anything further. The problem arrived, as problems in Kalen's world usually did, without warning and with bad intentions. His trouble with Sylvain Droit was not new. Droit ran a faction out of Laval that had been pushing at the edges of Kalen's territory for 2 years, the port access, specifically, which Droit needed and couldn't get because Kalen held the relevant relationships in an iron fist. Droit was younger, louder, more erratic. He compensated for limited sophistication with the willingness to do things Kalen's organization considered tactically embarrassing. He was the kind of man who escalated when de-escalation was available, because patience had always been someone else's virtue. Opal had been in the building for 5 weeks when Droit's people took her. She had left at noon to get lunch. She did this on Fridays, a 12-minute walk to a Vietnamese place on St. Catherine that did a soup that had gotten her through the previous winter. She'd told no one, because she went every Friday and it had never been relevant information. She was 2 blocks from the restaurant when a dark blue panel van pulled alongside her. She had time to think that this was extremely cinematic before the door slid open. There were 3 of them. She fought in the way large women with low centers of gravity can fight when motivated by genuine fear, badly, loudly, and with a great deal of inconvenient weight. She caught one of them in the knee with her heel. It didn't stop them, but he limped for the rest of the day, which felt like a moral victory. She came to in a warehouse somewhere that smelled of river water and old rubber, her wrists zip-tied to a folding chair. Her head ached. Her soup was going to be cold. The man who walked into her eyeline was not physically impressive, but had the specific energy of someone who'd spent years convincing himself he was. He was thin and angular, wearing a leather jacket he'd decided was intimidating, with the smile of a man who had prepared remarks. "You're Morrow's girl," he said. "I'm Morrow's administrative coordinator," Opal said. "There's a distinction." Sylvain Droit blinked. He had not expected that. "I'm going to call your boss, and you're going to help me get what I need from him." "I think you have a slightly optimistic read on my leverage," Opal said. "I've been there 5 weeks. I answer phones and sort files. I spilled coffee on him on day 1. I'm a temp. Word is he'd burn the city down for you," Droit said, and the way he said it was half taunt and half genuine confusion. Opal said nothing to that, because the thing was, she'd been trying not to think about whether it might be true. Droit made the call. He put it on speaker, which she suspected he'd practiced. The line connected on the second ring. What followed was not a negotiation. Kalen's voice came through the phone, quiet and terrifyingly level, the kind of quiet that had texture to it, and what he said to Droit in 45 seconds made 2 of the men in the room step backward without appearing to notice they'd done it. "Kalen," Opal said, because she couldn't help it, "don't give him anything." "I'm fine, I'll bill you for the missed lunch." There was a pause. Then, "Stop talking, Opal, that's fair." Droit ended the call. His hands were not entirely steady. He laughed too loudly, and said something about Kalen bluffing, about his perimeter, about how many men he had outside, and then he walked to the far end of the warehouse to take another call and left 2 guards with her. One by the door, one to her right, a big man with a neck tattoo who looked bored. Opal looked at the chair. She had been rotating her wrists since she'd come to, working the plastic ties against the edge of the chair arm, which was aluminium, and had a slightly rough seam where the pieces met. It had been slow work. Her wrists ached. She had also, in the past few minutes, been doing a quiet engineering and assessment of the chair itself, which was the lightweight folding kind that community centers bought in bulk, and which had a weight rating she was reasonably confident she exceeded. She thought about every time the world had made her feel that her body was a problem. She thought about the man who'd called her a word in a hallway and been out of the building by 10:15. She thought, not today. She shifted her weight forward. Then, in one committed motion, threw herself backward. The chair came apart like it was embarrassed to have ever been furniture. The back panel cracked clean off. The ties loosened in the sudden slack, and Opal hit the concrete and had enough presence of mind to roll rather than simply lie there. Which she wanted to do, because the concrete was very cold, and she was very tired. The guard with the neck tattoo said something and reached for her. She was already moving. Her hand found a length of steel conduit on the floor. Leftover construction material, 2 feet long and solid. And she swung it with both hands and the full weight of her body behind it, aiming for his midsection. She did not hit his midsection. She hit considerably lower, with a force that surprised both of them. The guard folded in a way that suggested he would need some time before he had thoughts about anything other than the immediate situation. Opal stepped over him, said, "I'm sorry," out of sheer reflex, and pressed herself against the wall near the large loading doors. She did not have to wait long. The doors came in fast and loud, and what followed was efficient and absolute. Kaelin moved through it the way she'd come to understand he moved through his world. With total economy of motion and the particular calm of someone for whom violence was a language they'd spoken long enough to stop thinking about grammar. It was over in less than 4 minutes. The warehouse settled into quiet. Rain on the roof, a distant sound of traffic, the smell of smoke. Opal's. She was sitting against the wall, knees drawn up, holding the conduit across her lap because she hadn't decided yet whether she was done needing it. She looked up. Kaelin crossed the floor toward her. His jacket was gone. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was a cut along his jaw she didn't think he'd noticed. He looked at her the way she'd seen him look at very few things, with the focused attention of someone trying to account for whether something he valued had been damaged. He crouched in front of her. His hand came up and very carefully moved the hair out of her face. His fingers were not gentle in the usual sense. They were precise. Like he was handling something that mattered, and he knew it. "You're hurt," he said. "Minor," she said. "I broke the chair. I see that. I also." She glanced toward the guard still on the floor. "I didn't mean to hit him there specifically. I was aiming for his ribs. My aim is not better than my Opal." His thumb rested at the corner of her cheekbone, just below the bruise that was already beginning to form where she'd hit the concrete. His voice was very quiet. "You got yourself free." "The chair helped," she said. "Low weight rating." Something happened to his expression that she had never seen on it before. It wasn't softness, exactly. It was something that had been kept at a precise temperature for a very long time and had shifted by a degree. He kissed her. It wasn't tentative, it wasn't exploratory. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision and was not uncertain about it. And she made a sound of pure surprise against his mouth before her hands came up and gripped the front of his ruined shirt, and she kissed him back with everything she'd been carefully not thinking about for 5 weeks. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "You're not a temp," he said. "I'm very much a temp," she said. "I don't even have benefits." "You have benefits," he said. "As of now, I need that in writing, Opal." "I'm not joking about the paperwork, Kaelin." He made a sound that his men nearby would later describe to each other in quiet, baffled voices as a laugh. A real one, the first any of them could remember. He stood and picked her up. All 270 pounds of her, with the particular ease of a man who had decided something and was finished with negotiations. She made a noise of protest and then stopped making it because his grip was very steady, and she was, underneath everything, exhausted. And it turned out that being carried by someone who had no doubts about whether they could carry you was a specific feeling she had not experienced before. He walked out through the open loading doors and into the rain. Back at Meridian Capital, things changed in ways that were hard to precisely document, but impossible to miss. The pastries continued. The boulangerie added a third item to the daily order, which Opal discovered was because Kaelin had asked what her favorite was, and then cross-referenced it with the menu. She hadn't told him. He'd asked the boulangerie, the men who moved through the 42nd floor. Garrett and the others, the quiet ones, the careful ones, did not change in any dramatic way. But the elevator door was always held. The heavy files were carried without being asked. A new chair appeared at her desk on a Monday morning, ergonomic, expensive, solid, rated for considerably more than she weighed. There was no note. There was never a note. She still tripped on the Persian rug. She always would. It was, she'd come to understand, a fixed feature of her relationship with that particular floor. She jammed the shredder twice more that month. She knocked a full coffee service off a cart during a meeting with a delegation from Vancouver, sending ceramic shards across imported hardwood, while 4 very serious men in suits watched in silence. And then Kalen, without looking up from the document he was reviewing, said, "Clean it up and bring the agenda," in the exact tone he used for everything, and she did, and the meeting continued, and afterward one of the Vancouver men asked Garrett quietly who the girl was. "She runs the office," Garrett said. "She just broke 8 cups." "She runs the office," Garrett said again, in a tone that closed the subject. The work was complicated, and Opal had stopped pretending to herself that she didn't know what it was. She was not naive. She had been raised in Verdun, not in a terrarium. She made her peace with it in the particular way people make peace with complicated things. Slowly, and without announcing it, finding the edges of what she could live with and staying inside them, and it turned out there was more room inside them than she'd expected, because the work she was doing was real work, and she was good at it, and she'd never in her life been in a room where she was treated like she was exactly enough. Kalen Morrow had built his empire on control and fear and the careful management of what other people wanted. He had not built it on love, because that was a liability, a pressure point, an open window in a secured building. And then Opal Hennessy had tripped over his rug, and he'd started leaving her pastries. And somehow, without any plan on either side, the window had come open. And the building had not fallen. He had stood in a warehouse in the rain and apologized to folding chairs, and he had felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the most dangerous thing in his life was the possibility of losing something he actually wanted to keep. She was still clumsy. She always would be. He had a new rug ordered with a flat edge instead of a raised border. He didn't tell her. She found out when she arrived Monday morning and didn't trip. And she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the floor. And then she looked at him, and he was reading a document with great concentration, and she sat down at her desk and said nothing. And the fact that she said nothing, the fact that she understood without needing it, explained, was the thing that settled it. Finally, all the way down. Opal Hennessy had walked into Meridian Capital as a temp with a bad center of gravity and left every single morning knowing exactly where she stood. In a world built on shifting ground, that was rarer than anyone who hadn't lived in it could understand. And Kalen Morrow, who had spent 20 years making sure nothing could touch him, had quietly, deliberately, made room for the one thing that could.